Frey, who is a high-profile accuser of Jeffrey Epstein and of Ghislaine Maxwell. Many of you might remember her from her accusations against Prince Andrew, and she's a highly credible person, witness, and we've seen some of her interviews on camera. She sued Ghislaine Maxwell back in 2015. These documents stem from that, and they show definitively that Ghislaine Maxwell has lied under oath in the court. Her lawyers have blatantly lied.
Right.
So let's lead off with that very first accusation, or not even accusation, that proof, which is that from that deposition, from that case, this is an email between Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, January 21st, 2015. Now, her lawyers had already said in her bail memo that 20 days ago, just 20 days ago, she had not communicated with Mr. Epstein in over a decade. So right off the bat, Crystal, blatant lie in the court of law. That's what we already know about.
Absolutely, and the details here are pretty chilling too. You have Epstein coaching her. Let's throw that back up. That's what that email is. Right. Coaching her on how to say, you know, that these are all lies and untrue, completely untrue, that she's been smeared, innuendos, slander, defamation, salacious lies, all that stuff. And then he goes on to say, you've done nothing wrong, hold your head up high, go to parties, get over it is basically what he says. So, again, the real bombshell here, the fact that the two were very clearly in communication.
Yes.
And that is
inspiring and to defeat these charges.
Absolutely, and that goes directly against what Maxwell's lawyers have been representing here. But wait, there's so much more.
There's some other stuff. And a lot of this was known. We didn't have the full documents. We knew that Virginia Giuffre had made this accusation. This one is about Bill Clinton. And again, this is a total bombshell. So let's throw that up there on the screen. And look, according to this interview, Bill Clinton was at Epstein's Island with Epstein, Maxwell, and, quote, 2 young girls. Now, there's no allegation here of sexual impropriety. President Clinton has denied on numerous occasions that he was ever on this Little St. Jeffrey's, I think is what it was called, that island in the Virgin Islands that was owned by Jeffrey Epstein. However, remember that from that Netflix documentary, with many of its flaws, and as I know I've heard from so many of you, they still had that interview with the IT technician for Jeffrey Epstein, who said somewhere between, I think it was the 90s and 2005, so his assumption is after Clinton left office, that he was seen just hanging out with Epstein on the veranda on Epstein's favorite part of the island. Again, not an accusation of sexual impropriety, of anything, just that he was there.
And that conflicts, and what's critical here is that conflicts with what he has said.
Yeah,
he denied.
Because he's never been on this island, and there is a part of this deposition also that talks to Maxwell about her interactions with President Clinton, the numerous times that he flew on Jeffrey Epstein's plane. Remember that there was also, remember those pictures that we brought you of Ghislaine and Kevin Spacey sitting on the throne, the British throne. That was actually part of a tour organized by Prince Andrew for Bill Clinton, Ghislaine Maxwell, Kevin Spacey, and Chris Tucker, I think, the guy from Rush Hour. So, motley crew of people.
Yeah.
Really, but, I mean, it just goes to show, again, how deep Ghislaine Maxwell was able to embed herself with really the elites. And I don't want to let Trump off the hook, too. Remember, Trump just said the whole, I wish her well, I've met her many times in Palm Beach. I mean, I don't know what the hell that one was.
Yeah, absolutely. And so again, what we could have here is allegations from Virginia Giuffre that Bill Clinton was, in fact, on the island, which is something that he has denied, which now makes it 2 individuals between Virginia Giuffre and also the worker on the island who reportedly placed Bill Clinton there. We also got some more information about Prince Andrew. Let's throw that one up. Okay, we've put this photo on the screen a number of times during this show. That is Prince Andrew with his arm wrapped around Virginia Giuffre when she is only a teenager. Of course, he has very non-credibly denied ever knowing her.
He says that's a fake. He claims that that photo is a fake. All right,
yeah.
Sure.
Okay, well, so apparently, and this is what's new here, we learned that the FBI had this photo in their possession for years.
2011.
Going back before even that 2011, this lawsuit that happened in 2011. So they had pieces.
That's right.
And so what was the holdup? Why haven't you done anything up until now?
Yeah, this is just so big here, because what it shows is that the FBI has had this allegation against Prince Andrew, an incredible photo that to back up this allegation since 2011. 9 years, okay? 9 years. Now, we also know that the FBI was supposedly, according to some of these depositions, in contact with some Epstein victims back in 2014. And yet, we saw inaction after inaction after inaction after inaction. And the FBI has a lot of explaining to do, which is that how do you have that photo within your possession and not bring it to a public light? Why is Prince Andrew only being hounded for questioning now? And remember this, he refuses to cooperate, no matter what his lawyers will tell you. He will not sit down with FBI investigators.
Right, and that speaks to one of the underlying, themes of this story, which is how these powerful people were able to escape accountability for so long. Why are there two systems of justice? Do you think that you could get away with those things and the FBI would leave you alone for 9 years? Not a chance. And then, there's a lot more in these documents. The last piece we really wanted to bring to you was regarding Alan Dershowitz, of course, very well-known, prominent lawyer, prominent defender of President Trump, especially in this era. So what this shows as well is that Dershowitz, she again is accusing him of having committed sexual acts against minors, and she also talks about how Dershowitz helped negotiate an agreement with a provision that provided protection for himself against criminal prosecution in Florida.
Allegedly to himself.
Allegedly, right. So this is, again, another piece tying him in. He very much denies all of these allegations very publicly and very, very forcefully, but this is another look at what exactly he is accused of.
There are a lot more names that are inside this deposition, but unfortunately they have been blacked out because the judge has essentially ruled in this particular case that if your non-party agreement, non-pertinent information, that your name cannot come out, so they remain sealed. And you can actually go, I'm actually looking at the documents right now, their names are blacked out in much of this testimony, and the blacked out number of names is a lot. So these are, continue to be a lot more information here, but these are kind of the bombshells that have come out, and it just one more peek behind the curtain of the life that Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell lived.
Yeah.
Dozens of people they allegedly victimized, and the many powerful people who worked with them in order to make that happen. Some of it is coming out, and we'll continue to keep you guys updated. Some more documents will be coming out on Monday.
Yeah.
I believe that those documents will have even more information in them.
Yeah, and I think to circle back to the beginning, the most important piece here is we have evidence that Maxwell and her attorneys were lying.
She's a liar.
Yeah. All right, more rising for you after this.
Sukun mabachoy.
Morning, we'll call the meeting to order. This morning we are hearing about national security challenges and U.S. military activities in the Greater Middle East and Africa as part of our ongoing posture hearings as we prepare for the FY21 budget. This is basically the presentation. Morning, we'll call the meeting to order. This morning we are hearing about national security challenges and U.S. military activities in the Greater Middle East and Africa as part of our ongoing posture hearings as we prepare for the FY21 budget. This is basically the presentation of the President's budget for these regions. And we have witnesses this morning, Ms. Catherine Wilbarker, Acting Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. I think this is the first time we've seen you since the job change, so congratulations and welcome back. General Kenneth McKenzie, who is the commander of the U.S. Central Command, and General Stephen Townsend, who is the commander of the U.S. Africa Command. Welcome, all of you. I look forward to hearing from your testimony about the very important regions that you are responsible for. And I think the big challenge as we're going through these posture hearings is the sheer number of challenges. And AFRICOM sort of got a lot of attention here recently because as we focused on the pivot to Asia, the focus on great power competition, there was the notion that, well, what can we sort of not do anymore? And Africa popped up, mainly because it's the first in the alphabet for the blank slate review there. I don't think they did it that way, but you came up first anyway. But it did prompt a very interesting discussion about how the world is interconnected. Having just returned from Macabell to Africa a few weeks ago, the great power competition is alive and well on the continent of Africa. So when we're looking at how we meet the national security challenges we have to look at them in a broad geographical way. Russia and China are certainly very active in Africa, as we are as well. So how do we meet our interests there? And I know there's been a lot of interest in that subject, and we'll look forward to those comments from the members who asked questions about that. And obviously, Central Command has been the central focus for going on 20 years now, between Afghanistan and Iraq and various activities in the Middle East. It continues to be a challenge. And while we are focused on great power competition, that great power competition, of course, is present in the Central Command as well. But we also have to continue to be worried about the threat from violent extremist organizations. And the lesson learned right back to 9/11, starting in Afghanistan, an ungoverned space, became fertile ground for a dangerous terrorist organization to find safe haven and plot and plan attacks against us in our interests. And that risk is still there. If we do not find partners in regions like the Central Command represents to deter those groups from forming, they will form, and they are still there. ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and various other offshoots. So we have to have a plan to meet all of our challenges in a reasonable way within our budget. And I think these two regions are particularly ripe for a discussion of how we do that. If you can sort of look at the needs there, and you can very quickly overwhelm them in terms of the resources we have available. Let me say I'm 100% confident with the best U.S. military the world has ever seen, with the number of partners that we have and capabilities that we can bring to bear, that we can absolutely meet those challenges. If we're smart, if we make the right resource decisions, if we manage risks in an appropriate way, and if we give our troops the support they need, I'm 100% confident we can meet those challenges, even in complex parts of the world, like the two that you gentlemen represent. Lastly, given what's going on in the world, we will need to hear from you about how the coronavirus is impacting the regions. Obviously, Iran is one of the most impacted countries, and how that affects things, and how it's affecting your operations. As we've seen various cancellations, travel restrictions, difficulties. Your perspective of how that's going to impact your responsibility will be very helpful in informing us how we can help you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me join in welcoming each of our witnesses here today. General Kinsey, let me begin by expressing condolences at the loss of two Marines in Iraq. My understanding is that we're working with the Iraqi forces to clear out ISIS complex there, and have the ultimate sacrifice here at home. I support the national defense strategy. I completely agree, and I think it makes sense to put greater emphasis on great power competition. I completely agree with the chairman that great power competition takes place all over the world. And his recent trip, as well as these two maps that are on front of us, so Russian Chinese activity in Africa is one example. Also takes place in the Middle East and South Asia. It occurs all over the world. But rest assured, the job against terrorism is not done yet. They are certainly not finished with us. And we cannot look to the way this president said say peace has broken out, that they're going to leave us alone. And I think that, we get focused on different issues as time goes on. I think it's an important reminder that every day there are men and women risking their lives to protect us here at home from terrorist threats. That's true in Afghanistan, it's true in Iraq, Syria, and it's true in Africa. It's true in a variety of places around the world. And so as we talk about great power competition, I don't think we can forget the other issue, and we certainly can't afford to walk away from it. And y'all's to AORs, that's the issue.
Hey, before we begin, two quick programming announcements. We are again going into the first quarter on our questions, so we'll start with the primary in the first quarter. Second, we'll have a classified hearing after the public hearing, so we will stop exactly at the head upstairs to 12 for the classified portion of this hearing. With that,
Chairman Smith, ranking members, and very distinguished members of this committee. We are grateful for the opportunity to testify today. I would like to start by thanking the men and women of the Department of Defense whose dedication and sacrifices enable us to achieve our objectives in the Middle East, Africa, and elsewhere. I would also like to recognize the strong collaboration and bipartisan support provided by this committee. As I said last year, as a former professional staffer on multiple committees in Congress, I understand that this is a vital institution, ensuring our military has the resources, oversight, and political legitimacy to succeed even if the hard missions we pivot. Congress has also helps ensure we have civilian control of the military, as enshrined in the Constitution and required for the preservation of our democratic values. So thank you for all you do. As you know, our approach to Middle East and Africa policy is guided by our national security strategy and our NDS. Our overall goals are to protect the American people, defend the homeland, and promote prosperity and peace from a position of strength. As you have heard numerous times, our NDS directs the department to focus on near-peer competition while remaining vigilant in countering threats from rogue states like Iran and North Korea, and continuing to address violent extremist organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. The need to address near-peer competitors requires us to make adjustments to our posture and avoid prioritizing near-term problems at the expense of building readiness and capacity for high-end conflict in the future. As we do so, though, we must also deter and confront current adversaries while avoiding miscalculation or escalation that would distract and undermine our national security interests. In the Middle East, the United States strategy is to keep the region from getting St. Petersburg or Paris or dominated by any power hostile to the United States. The department is focused on ensuring continued success against ISIS and Al-Qaeda, strengthening deterrence and our defenses against Iran, and competing with China and Russia. This requires investing in sustainable partnerships as a whole of government effort. As to Afghanistan, our mission is guided by the President's South Asia strategy. As you are aware, on February 29th, the President announced an agreement with the Taliban that is a major step toward political settlement, but it is just the first step. We have insisted to the Taliban that they abide by their counterterrorism commitments, negotiate in good faith with all Afghan stakeholders, and not restart violence. However, we are prepared for all eventualities. Our presence in Afghanistan is conditions-based, and future posture will be based on the facts on the ground. In Africa, the United States maintains a whole-government approach to advancing security and stability on the continent. Our commitment to the African continent includes diplomatic, military, and economic efforts. And persistent U.S. presence is not the only measure of DoD's commitment. Our commitment is demonstrated by our counterterrorism training and operations, our dynamic force deployment, military training, exercises, foreign military sales, intelligence sharing, crisis responses, and emergency humanitarian assistance. So I'll close by saying I think the department is well positioned to address all the range of threats that we face. Our approach helps us meet a variety of present and future threats while enhancing the strength and agility of our forces. Again, thanks for the opportunity to fight us.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, distinguished members of the House Armed Services Committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify here today. I'm proud to testify alongside General Steve Townsend from AFRICOM and Ms. Katie Whitbarger from Overseas Policy. It's this partnership within DoD, across COCOM, and between the interagencies that ensures synchronized execution of the National Defense Strategy. My senior enlisted leader, Fleet Master Chief Jamie Gradell of the Navy, is also with me today. Before I begin, I would like to recognize the sacrifice of Captain Moses Navas and Gunnery Sergeant Diego Conde, who were killed in action against ISIS last Sunday in the Karaj Chalk Mountains in Iraq on its North Task Force for Ireland. They will be remembered. Today, there are nearly 90,000 men and women serving within the 20 nations providing Central Command, as well as the headquarters in Tampa. I'm proud of their remarkable dedication and humbled by their personal sacrifice, and it's my honor to serve with them. They are young Americans in the line of fire, working to prevent attacks on the homeland, counter destabilizing regional influence, prevent the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and assure the freedom of navigation through international waterways. Your annual and timely passage of both the National Defense Authorization Act and the Defense Appropriation Bills honors your courage and sacrifice. I encourage you to maintain this tradition. Keeping a pledge for my confirmation hearing in December 2018, I appear before you and offer my best military advice. My written statement highlights several nations, areas, and interests within the Central Command, but my opening statement today will focus on Iran. The National Defense Strategy directs us to work with partners to deny the Iranian regime all paths to a nuclear weapon and to neutralize Iranian malign influence. This is no easy task. Iran is persistent and is growing its arsenal of ballistic missiles despite international condemnation. Iran remains the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism. Since May 2019, Iranian proxies and Shia militia groups in Iraq have increased attacks on U.S. interests and conducted scores of unmanned aerial system reconnaissance flights near U.S. and Iraqi security force bases. The Iranian regime has attacked or seized foreign vessels in the Gulf, sponsored attacks by Houthi forces from Yemen to Saudi Arabia, continued the export of lethal aid to destabilizing groups across the region, and carried out an unprecedented cruise missile and UAS attack in September against oil In early January, Iran launched more than a dozen ballistic missiles in a deliberate attack against U.S. and coalition forces at 2 bases in Iraq. This state-sponsored missile strike crossed the threshold compared to previous attacks and has probably set a lower bar for future actions by the regime. While periods of decreased tension may provide the illusion of a return to normalcy, ample intelligence indicates the regime's desire to continue malign activities that threaten lives, destabilize sovereign nations, and threaten freedom of navigation, regional commerce, global energy supplies, and global economy. At CENTCOM, we recognize that so long as the U.S. applies diplomatic and economic pressure, the joint commitment offers to deter Iran from employing the military element of power to counter Iraq. Our presence sends a clear signal about our capabilities and our will to defend partners and U.S. national interests. Going forward, it is CENTCOM's objective to posture forces in the region with the operational depth to achieve a consistent state of deterrence against Iran and be adaptable to future Iranian threats. The FY 2021 DoD budget supports CENTCOM's ability to keep our forces agile, lethal, and adaptable. As we work with our partners to safeguard our mutual interests, we do so with the knowledge that we are stronger together. Key to building and maintaining regional partnerships is the authorization, the funding, and the employment of security assistance programs. Additionally, the National Guard State Partnership Program currently cultivates relationships and improves interoperability with 6 nations across the CENTCOM AOR, with more considering entry. Again, the FY 2021 budget supports building new partnerships and forming an enduring Middle East coalition. As CENTCOM continues ongoing operations, we appreciate the efforts of our DoD civilian leadership, acknowledge the teamwork of the interagency, and thank the members of Congress for your staffs. Without this consistent backing, we would be unable to accomplish our mission. In order for America's armed forces to sustain all remaining dominance, the Department requires your support as well as predictable, adequate, and timely funding. Mr. Chairman, thank you, members of the committee. Thanks again for all you do for our families.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, and members of the committee, good morning and thank you for the opportunity to appear today. It's a privilege to be a part of and lead America's exceptional men and women of U.S. Africa Command, who are dedicated to protecting America and advancing our interests on the African continent. This morning I'm accompanied by my State Department Foreign Policy Advisor, Mr. Russ Schiebel, and AFRICOM's new Command Senior Enlisted Leader, Marine Sergeant Major Richard Clay. I'd like to take a moment to honor the memories of 3 Americans, U.S. Army Specialist Henry J. Mayfield Jr., Mr. Bruce Tripper, and Mr. Dustin Harrison, who lost their lives in the service of our nation on January 5th at Mandalay Camp. Their families, our thoughts and prayers are with you. Their loved ones died while protecting the American people from the very real threat of the Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab terrorist groups. I'm here this morning with my battle buddies and friends, Will Margaret and John McKenzie, to discuss shared challenges and opportunities in our areas of responsibility while furthering joint force readiness. Africa overwatches a global crossroads with strategic choke points and sea lines of communication that are essential to global commerce and critical to U.S. operations in the world. Our future security and prosperity rest on our strategic access and influence in Africa in times of crisis. U.S. Africa Command is engaged in an ongoing blank slate, now COCOM review. In concert with the Department of Defense, we developed a prioritized list of objectives and actions to protect the homeland and secure our strategic interests in Africa while focusing the American taxpayers' investments in the right areas. Africa is key terrain for competition with China and Russia, who are aggressively using economic and military means to expand access and influence. I believe Africa offers America a competitive edge over China and Russia, and we should take advantage of it. We will grow more efficient, contribute to higher defense priorities, and refocus resources to global power competition. But we cannot take pressure on major terrorist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. These groups and many others remain an inconvenient reality in Africa. While we should not try to confront each one, we should remain resolute in confronting those who threaten American interests in the region and the American homeland. Today, AFRICOM does that using a very light and relatively low-cost footprint by supporting African and international partners who are leading these efforts. In my first 8 months on the job, I've learned that small investments, few troops and a few bucks can go a long way and make a real difference in Africa. Our whole government and partner-centered approach acts as a force multiplier to address Africa's many complex challenges. What AFRICOM accomplishes with a few people and a few dollars on a continent 3.5 times the size of the continent of the United States is a bargain for the American taxpayer and low-cost insurance for America. A secure and stable Africa remains an enduring American interest. The U.S. Africa Command remains ready to protect and advance American interests and respond to crises in Africa. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you for your continued support for our armed forces. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. General McKenzie, and actually Mr. Milberger as well, did answer a question about the Taliban peace treaty and understand the negotiations that we've had with the Taliban. The key part now is the Taliban negotiating with the Afghan government. That seems problematic. And I support the effort to try to find a peaceful solution to enable us to reduce our footprint and rely more on partners. But how do you see that negotiation between the Taliban and the Afghan government going? What needs to happen in order for this peace agreement to go forward?
I'll begin recognizing this is largely a State Department lead and my colleagues in IPSA as well. But from our perspective, from the Secretary's perspective, as he said, peace agreement is not perfect, but it is a good first step, and the inter-Afghan dialogue is supportive of that. We do have suggestions as related to this morning, before I left, that there might be somewhat an offer from President Ghani to provide some prisoner releases. That is a basic part of the initial agreement between the U.S. and the Taliban. That was not part, the Afghans were not in that piece of, the Afghan government was not piece that part of the agreement. But I do think we might have actual successful good faith efforts, maybe even today, that will get the intra-Afghan conversation started.
And Joe McKenzie, how is it affecting operations at the moment?
Sir, thank you. The Taliban need to keep their part of the bargain, and they are continuing attacks. Those attacks are relatively low in scale. They are not directed against coalition forces. They are not occurring in city centers. They're occurring at isolated checkpoints where those attacks are occurring, and they're not consistent with the movement toward a negotiated settlement, and they're not consistent with the undertaking of May.
General Townsend, focusing on West Africa in particular, I was alarmed when I was there at the growing threat of the violent extremist organizations in the region. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, to varying degrees, their governments are all under pressure. There are portions of their country that are increasingly outside of their control. How do you see that fight going in those three particular countries, and what do we need to do to stop the spread of those groups? And I guess the other question would be, where do you see the risk that those groups will use those safe havens to plan larger operations?
Chairman, West Africa and the Sahel region, I think that the Western and international and African efforts there are not getting the job done. ISIS and Al-Qaeda are on the march in West Africa. They're having success. International efforts are not. So why is that? I think that there's, the African partners there don't have a lot of capacity or capability. There's a lot of Western assistance going in there, European-led, French-led, European-led, U.S. in support. I think it's insufficient and it's uncoordinated. I think the French and the Europeans have recognized this, and they're taking steps to make it better coordinated. And those efforts might actually be sufficient if they were better coordinated. If we don't turn this around in West Africa, I think it becomes a growing threat in the region. I think the threat will begin to impact on the littoral states. It's already started to reach the northern fringes of the littoral states. I think that Europe can and should do more for America to do more in this part of the world. I think the problem that manifests from West Africa will manifest in Europe before it manifests in America. But I do believe that if ISIS can carve out the caliphate, or Al-Qaeda can, they will attempt to in West Africa.
Thank you, Mr. Thunberg.
Let me just follow up on the chairman, really, and General McKenzie and General Townsend, would each of you give us a thumbnail sketch of the
Afghanistan, the principal threat that could threaten our homeland or the homelands of our allies and partners is either ISIS-K or elements of Al-Qaeda. Both of those forces are under considerable pressure now from us pushed up into the east of Afghanistan. Unlimited CT pressure is maintained. It is likely they will find it very hard to achieve a degree of coordination necessary to attack. We believe that that pressure is relieved at some point in those ungoverned spaces. They would regain that capability. So that's one thing. The next thing I would note is the Taliban actually does not entertain attack plans against the United States. They're a regional entity. There are good reasons why have been conducting operations against them because of the fact they host two other organizations that actually form to destroy us. But the Taliban themselves are not poised or have any background attacking, certainly not attacking our homeland. I would say in the far west end of here, in the Idlib pocket, there are remnants of Al-Qaeda and remnants of ISIS that do entertain attack plans against us. They're being compressed right now. It's hard for them to generate those attacks at the moment because the conflict is going on out there. And that conflict, while it does have the effect of limiting their ability to operate against us, it's also going to have profoundly horrific humanitarian outcomes in the western part of Syria. So we watch that carefully. In the south, in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP still has visions of attacking the United States. They are under pressure. We find it hard to realize that. But if left unconstrained, undoubtedly they would be generated within a threat to us as well. Last, I need to mention the largest state sponsor or the terror organization of here, the Iranian Threat Network, where there is shooting militia groups in Iraq, Lebanese Hezbollah, or Qassam Hezbollah. All of those entities entertain to some degree desire to attack Americans. Generally in theater, but Iran's reach is not only regional, it is global, and in fact, as you know, it is being manifested a few miles from where you're standing right now.
I'll go from West Africa and Sahel, as I was discussing a moment ago. The threat there is both ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda has an arm, a branch there called JNIM, Jamaat Nusra al-Islam. That group is as part of Al-Qaeda as any group is on the planet. And they are a growing threat there. And what's the interesting dynamic that we see in West Africa that we don't see in other parts of the world, there Al-Qaeda and ISIS cooperate with one another. I can't really explain that. I've been asked before if I thought that might be something new that we see growing. I don't think so. I think it's a local phenomenon that these folks have grown up with each other, known each other all their lives. One joined one gang, one joined the other, and so they cooperate with one another. This threat, if it grows, it continues to grow at the pace it has, and we're seeing a five-fold increase since last year just in Sahel alone. We're going to see that threat emerge and manifest in the littoral states of West Africa. I think unchecked, this threat becomes a threat beyond the region. Moving to the north, we have ISIS there in Libya. That threat has been significantly reduced, and we are keeping close watch on that to ensure that it stays that way. We've been able to do that with working with both sides of the Libyan civil war. They have both supported our counterterrorism efforts there. Moving to the east, there's a small presence of ISIS in Somalia and East Africa, but it's not a great operational concern. But Al-Shabaab is the largest and most kinetically violent arm of Al-Qaeda. And they are a serious threat to not only the Somali people, but the entire region. One example is a recent attack in Kenya. Another example is their threats to embassies in the region outside of Somalia. I can discuss more about the threat of Al-Shabaab in a closed hearing. I would just say that I'm of the belief that Al-Shabaab today poses a significant threat to American interests in the region, and that threat would continue to threaten anywhere in Somalia or Iraq and Somalia. And I also believe that if left unchecked, and we can put a fair amount of pressure on Al-Shabaab, if left unchecked, I believe that would manifest into an international threat.
Thank you, and it's great to go to the beginning so we can talk about aircraft carriers up front. So I wanted to start with General McKenzie. Recently, the Abraham Lincoln completed the longest deployment for a carrier since the Vietnam War, and that was the casualty of the Harry S. Truman, which made it unable to deploy on time. I was just giving that background to focus on how vital is it to your completing your mission to have a continuous carrier presence in the Gulf.
The aircraft carrier brings mobility, it brings offensive firepower, it brings defensive firepower. We can position it, we can move it around to complicate an adversary's targeting. So it's a uniquely American piece of capability. Additionally, the virtue of the aircraft carrier is there are no access, basing, and overstrike restrictions that operate on forces that launch from that carrier. So that gives me great flexibility. Having said all of that, it also has a profound deterring effect, principally upon the land. They know where the carrier is, they track the presence of the carrier, and I view a carrier as a critical part of a deterrent posture effective against the land.
So that actually leads into what the next part of my question would be is, if you were to deploy Air Force assets to the region, would you feel that you could have an equivalent deterrent effect by Air Force and a combination of other assets in the region if you were not to have a continuous carrier presence? And then secondly, has the carrier presence or any of our presence actually deterred any of the recent Iranian aggression? Because they continue to harass, aggress, even though we are putting more forces there. So I was wondering what your assessment of that was.
Sure, so I can think of land-based air power as complementary to sea-based air power. Again, we can use it both. They both bring unique capabilities. Again, the particular and unique advantage of sea-based air power is its launches from the east of the United States sovereignty. So there are no restrictions that can be placed on where those airplanes go or what they do, which gives the commander-in-chief significant flexibility as we look at what we might want to do. So that's the military component of it. It is my best judgment that we have reestablished a form of rough deterrence, what I would call contested deterrence, with Iran in the wake of the strike on Qasem Soleimani and the attack on our bases. And part of that deterrence is obtained by our obvious force presence in the theater. Force presence that was not there in the spring of 2019 that led them to undertake a cycle of violence that culminated in January.
Thank you. And pivoting more on that continuous presence, and I switched to Bill Barger. Recently, and in your statement here, you discussed dynamic force employment. And in January, as Lincoln was heading home, a spokesman for Naval Air Force in San Diego said the new Navy deployment model of dynamic force employment means less predictable deployments will become more routine. So less predictable will be the routine. And the statement went on to say this deployment is not ideal. It's something that's going to become a regular thing, but they're not going to be as predictable as they were in the past. Our crews and families should, prior to deployment, discuss the possibility of something like this, i.e. an extended deployment happening. Do you think that the extension of the Lincoln was an example of what you really mean by dynamic force deployment? And should we expect deployments to be of longer duration, 8 months, such as the Lincoln, in order to satisfy these requirements in these AORs?
Thanks for the question. I don't think we saw that particular example as a key example of dynamic force employment. We wanted
So you think that was a misstatement by the spokesman?
No, I think what we want to see is that dynamic force employment allows us to be, as I think the spokesman was trying to say, strategically predictable but operationally unpredictable. But we have to have the kind of forces that can respond to current events, both based on the adversary, but also based on the situations within our forces. So I would say that is that's common, but it's something that we need to be prepared for.
So would you say that we have been able to respond adequately when we had the delay in the Harry S. Truman and the extension of the Lincoln? For the combatant commanders specifically, and specifically for CENTCOM, have you felt that the Navy and the carrier fleet has been able to respond adequately to meet your needs for deterrence within the region?
Through heroic efforts and just tremendous flexibility, yes, they have been able to do that. I am keenly aware of the total burden that places on the Navy in particular and the Joint Force in general when they meet these requirements.
Thank you. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Waltz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I certainly share the condolences for the 2 Marines that we just lost fighting ISIS, and I think that dynamic, fighting ISIS right now, or resurgent ISIS in Iraq, and what we just went through in Syria, is exactly what we want to prevent happening in Afghanistan and Pakistan. General McKenzie, you just mentioned a moment ago, you just testified that we have sufficient pressure on ISIS and Al-Qaeda to keep them on their back foot, but if we relieve that pressure, they could be and would likely be resurgent. So let's just fast forward a bit. Let's presume the Taliban is sincere about peace. They enter into a process with the Afghan government. They meet all of our conditions for a full withdrawal in 14 months. Although I have a lot of questions about what those conditions are, which I'll hold for the classified setting. But let's presume all of that happens. I'm struggling to wrap my mind around how the Taliban has a military. Military capability, even partnered with the Afghan army, which I think we would agree is not independently operable at this point, to keep that sufficient pressure on half the world's terrorist organizations in one of the most difficult places in the world. So how does that help me understand, help all of us understand how that happens in the absence of U.S. forces? Does the Taliban have the military capability, along with the Afghan army, to keep sufficient pressure?
Over the last several months in eastern Afghanistan, we watched the Taliban compress and crush ISIS presence on the ground in southern Nangarhar province, and they've been very effective doing that. That's some of the worst terrain in the world. They paid a very steep price in their own fighters.
Was that independent of our support?
There was very limited support from us, and I would characterize that as very limited support. So they demonstrated capability to it's a bloody mess, but they did it. In fact, ISIS really now no longer holds ground in Nangarhar province. They're trying to reestablish themselves up to the north and other provinces, and it remains yet to be seen if they're going to be successful doing that. And we'll know over time if they are. But they demonstrated the capability to do that. Frankly, sir, it is more a question of will than capability, and that will have to be developed in the fullness of time. I defer to no one in my distrust of the Taliban. But we will have the opportunity.
So just to be clear, sorry, I have limited time. You believe in the absence of all U.S. forces, your military advice, the Taliban and the Afghan army have sufficient military capability to keep all of those, not just ISIS, Al-Qaeda, everything that exists in Pakistan, to keep them at bay, to keep the homeland safe. And I would just remark that we all know that if we have to fight our way back in, that we will be tending, I think, many more funerals than a current sustained pressure campaign with limited forces.
First of all, I share those concerns. I think it's a very reasonable concern. It is less a capability than it is a question of will. And it's less a question of will against ISIS than it is against Al-Qaeda. And those are things that we'll just have to see in order to believe as we go forward. The conditions are set. Or they either meet those conditions or they don't meet those conditions.
If we shut down Bagram Air Base, I think it's important to have on the record here, in Syria, in Yemen, and other places, we have basing capabilities around those countries, whether it's Incirlik, Idlib, Djibouti. What do we have around Afghanistan? Should those presumptions, should they not have the capability of the Taliban and ANA, what other bases do we have in terms of a plan B to be able to conduct operations into Afghanistan and the FATA or the Western Pakistan?
So right now, we're executing withdrawal.
In the absence of Bagram. I mean, assuming playing this all out, we withdraw all forces.
So we have no plans beyond going to 8,600 right now. No one's given me any guidance to go to a war.
There's a public statement of 0 forces, full withdrawal in 14 months.
There is, however, we have not developed any clear plans to do
I think it's also worth noting that we still have an American hostage held by the Taliban, just taken in the last few months. So I would be extremely concerned to see Taliban prisoner releases while the Taliban and the Haqqani network are holding a U.S. citizen, former Navy diver, hostage. And then the last piece, in terms of great power competition, I can't think of another American military base or coalition military base, now that Manas is gone, besides Bagram on China's western flank, can you talk to the western flank of China and what platforms we have there?
So the platforms we have are intermittent platforms. We go in, conduct joint training, but we have no permanent platform other than the stance of the United States.
Thank you, everyone, for your service. I appreciate the testimony. Ms. Escobar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And
I'm sorry.
thanks.
I apologize. I'm sorry. I was right. Ms. Escobar, go ahead. Sorry. Let's go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and many thanks to our witnesses for your presence here today, for your service. And I just want to say at the outset, obviously we all want to see peace happen. We are hoping for successful conversations between the Taliban and the Afghan government, but I do have some serious concerns, General McKenzie. Secretary Esper has authorized the drawdown of the 8,600 troops. That's happening. That's happening before the deal between the Taliban and the Afghan government is sealed and worked out. Given recent events, especially our need to strike against Taliban fighters just days after we signed the peace deal, what confidence do you have in the Taliban honoring their commitments to us? You keep saying it's not a question of capacity, but that it's more a question of will. What confidence do you have in that will?
So I have no confidence because I'm going to be driven by the observed facts. Either they will draw down the current level of attacks or they won't. And if they're unable to draw down the current levels of attacks, then political leadership will be able to make decisions based on that. But it doesn't matter whether I'm optimistic or I'm pessimistic. We'll see what happens on the ground. Today, Taliban attacks are higher than we believe are consistent with an idea to actually carry out this plan. And that may be because the Taliban has made a decision at the top to continue those attacks and presses. It may be because the Taliban's leadership is fractured. And it takes a while to get all this down to the subordinate leaders. Their command and control is not as effective or as rapid as ours. We will know very soon. But I would say, first of all, right now, attacks are higher than we want, although they have not chosen to attack coalition forces. They have not chosen to attack inside the major urban areas, although ISIS has conducted some of those attacks. So we will see what happens going forward. But the last point is we are going to go to 8,600, and we're going to achieve that here by the middle of the summer. It is my best judgment and the judgment of the commander on the ground, Scott Miller, that we can be very effective in our CP efforts at that force level.
What is our plan specifically, and who makes the determination about when that line is crossed, when we've had enough, when we're not seeing enough progress? Are there specifics? I understand you may not be able to divulge those in an unclassified setting, but are there very specific measures that we will be using? Is it somebody's sense?
So we have a very sophisticated system for tracking attacks, how many were initiated, how many casualties were caused as a result of those attacks, where those attacks are occurred. We report that, and I have a recommendation on that, and Miller has a recommendation on that. It goes to the chairman of the secretary. The decision about what is tolerable and what is not tolerable is not a military decision. That's a political decision, a policy decision. I defer that to Ms. Goldberger to talk about.
I'll just add what I heard the Secretary, and I think probably the Secretary say in response to Mr. Walsh's question as well. 14 on the Morning Zero is an aspirational benchmark based on the conditions being achieved. The Secretary is well prepared to look at the terrain in a few months and see what the Afghans and the Taliban have come to. And he's prepared, and he has said to me, and I think he has said to the committees, to readjust our force posture up or down based on what the conditions require to achieve our objectives, which are to continue to ensure Afghanistan is not a single leader prepared to particularly hit the homeland. So he is prepared to look at the troops on the ground and make decisions accordingly.
Thank you. And Ms. Goldberger, we know that we're at the beginning of the process, and understandably we've got to wait and see and have high hopes, but obviously keep close watch. But the intra-Afghan dialogue phase, which was supposed to start today, has been delayed. How do we know this is not just the Taliban trying to run out the clock?
Sure. I mean, like I said before I arrived this morning, I did ask if there's any updates, and it did seem like there might be sort of a full-release from Donnie coming down. We actually will start this conversation today. I think all of us are being somewhat skeptical that this is going to work precisely as planned, but remain open and flexible to the Afghans over time working this out for themselves. And our interests are continuing to put political pressure on them to achieve that objective
appreciate it. Let's stay on the subject of Afghanistan, which seems to be insignificant. We may have time hop to Syria just to keep us entertained here. I think Mr. Walt's comment, which I want to reinforce, is that John McKenzie, correct me, but I think the ability to manage or to keep ISIS under control in Afghanistan very much depends upon the Taliban working with the Afghan army in some cooperative manner to manage that or to keep that under control. Yet we haven't exactly seen that the Taliban seems interested in doing that. Am I mistaken in my impression at this point in time?
You are correct. We have not seen any movement in that direction. I would agree that coming to some ability to operate together, or at least in a complementary fashion, is going to be critical to their movement forward.
Well, keeping with Mr. Walsh's question, the reality is as well that zero may be an aspirational goal. The point that he makes, which with all due respect, sir, you avoided was if we withdraw from Bagram, if they draw out the clock, don't attack coalition U.S. forces, continue the current mode they're at, we then have to have to face going back in, because it's my impression we don't have an alternative kind of staging that they're in that area. Is that incorrect? Leaving Bagram is a problem.
If we were to pull out completely from Afghanistan, you are correct. We've looked at all kinds of over-the-horizon options, and none of them are particularly good. Back in 2001, 2002, it was very difficult to get into Afghanistan in the first place. Those problems would present themselves again, so I acknowledge that. The only point I would make is, and again, I emphasize, I'm not optimistic or pessimistic. I'm just going to be driven by the facts here as we see it. Over a 14-month period, the Taliban are also going to be acted upon by the Afghans. So it's not simply that the Taliban have a perfect secret plan to take over. You know, there are a lot of people in Afghanistan that have a strong view of the Taliban, and the Taliban consistently polls at about 12% popularity in Afghanistan. So they face their challenges too, and we should not assume that they will run to victory as we withdraw.
Mr. Wilberger, if you could relay, I think Secretary Esper, and maybe you could give me a chance to relate to the Secretary of State. I'm not sure it's an adequate standard to say so long as the Taliban dial back or stop attacks on coalition U.S. forces, and we're comfortable saying it's all good in Afghanistan. I support it. We don't want to be there. We've been there far too long now. But the idea that so long as you don't bother us, we'll go away and hope you don't bother anything in the future is let me put it this way. I told my management staff when I ran a company, hope is not a plan. It's the last step before desperation. And we need to have more indication that the Taliban and Afghans can actually work in some manner cooperatively before we just walk away and say we're done with it, because we do not want to have to go back in. That would be catastrophic.
Understood. I would relay that back. I do think part of the conditions that we expect the Taliban to live up to is ensuring that they are not renewing their counterterrorism activities that brings insecurity and brings lack of stability to the entire country. I mean, I've heard the Secretary say numerous times that he is prepared to ensure that we will defend our interests, and that is again going after these terrorist elements that will now in future pose an external operations threat to us.
Well, our interest also included the one U.S. Armed Forces hostage that the Taliban hold. And if I were in a different seat, and I'm not, I'm in the seat, there's no way in God's green earth I'd sign off on the agreement until that hostage was put in front of me in good condition. The idea that they are holding a member of our armed forces and we sign some agreement offends me, and I think, frankly, if I asked privately the gentleman sitting to your left, I'm not sure there would be equally offended. We want him back. We want him back now. We want him back in good shape.
There's one thing I will add. I think this administration has been very, very focused on hostage releases and rescues, so it continues to be a priority, but I take the point.
Well, focus is one thing. Somebody needs to relay the message that it's not acceptable. I'm offended by it. Quickly, if I can make a comment about Syria, I think someone needs to explain to, not sure our commanders as well, but also to the forces on the ground and the American people where our objectives are in Syria. They seem to be changing dramatically, and it's not helpful. It's not helpful to our allies. It's not helpful to our forces on the ground. I'm not sure we understand them here. I was pretty blunt about my assessment that these material changes simply do not allow for an effective command in Syria and the U.S. following. So someone needs to explain to Congress and remind the gentleman sitting to your left what our objective is in Syria, and when we define that we've met that objective, we're prepared to leave. So I would ask simply someone sometime, please, because that would be helpful.
Thank you. The gentleman's out of time. Ms. Trey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman McKenzie, thank you for being here. You recently indicated that your biggest concern in the near term was not necessarily a direct Iranian attack. It's their proxies in areas like Iraq and Syria where they could come against us. And in your written testimony, you also indicated that ample intelligence points to Iran's desire to continue malign activities that threaten Americans' lives. So can you please describe the threat of Iranian retaliation as you understand it, conventional or by proxy forces, to us, our soldiers, and to our allies?
Certainly. So we believe that Iran has a long-term vision of ejecting the United States from the theater, from the Central Command region. And specifically the place where they'd like to see that first would be in Iraq. Is the place that they would like to start. So they would believe they can apply considerable pressure on us, raise the level of playing high enough so it would come out. They have a lot of tools to do that in Iraq. They have a large Shia militia group there, numbering in the tens of thousands, that is responsive in varying degrees to Iranian control. But nonetheless, they hold everything from explosively formed penetrators, which killed a lot of people in Iraq in the 2007-2010 period, to large rockets and precise missiles that they could employ. The Iranian desire, I believe, would be to try to do that in a manner that's not completely attributable to Iran. They may be wrong in making that guess, because we're pretty confident we can determine attribution. But what we've seen are a number of attacks on the U.S. Embassy, some as recent as just less than 2 weeks ago. Rockets fell very close. Rockets fall inside the embassy compound. We have a variety of things that we do to protect ourselves, and we've been good so far in doing that. That luck's not going to hold out forever. At some point, the degree of Iranian command and control over those Shia militia groups may be tested. I've always said that Iran can certainly direct attacks in Iraq. Iran may not be able to prevent attacks in Iraq. And frankly, the fact that Qasem Soleimani is no longer there to tie it all together makes it a little more difficult for it to affect command and control. Even though I think the threat is less than it is.
Sure. Thank you. So as we draw down troops in Afghanistan, I'm wondering, are we expanding our military footprint in the region? Are we reshuffling troops? And I ask because I'm concerned with force protection, but I'd also like visibility into what our troop presence is going to look like as we project it through the year.
Certainly. So we're on a glide slope to draw down to 8,600 in Afghanistan. We'll reach that goal by the middle of the summer. We will have, in my judgment, adequate force protection for those forces that remain there. On the other end of the theater, in Iraq, we've got around 5,000 U.S. forces there. That's a number in Syria, and I'll be happy to talk about that in the closed session just a little bit later. But we believe that in general, we have adequate force protection measures there. We are also in the process of bringing air defense systems, ballistic missile defense systems, into Iraq in particular to protect ourselves against another potential Iranian attack. So we will look at those. I balance those two active theaters all the time. Now, there are other forces, obviously, in the theater as well. Over the last few months, as you know, we brought forces into Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, both to assure them and to add operational depth to our force presentation against Iran in order to deter them. Our buildup at Prince Sultan Air Base, or PSAD, is indicative of that. The beauty of that base is it is out of short-range ballistic missile range of Iran, but yet is close enough for our various types of fighter attack aircraft to operate out of there. It is well defended and provides significant additional depth in the theater. We talked a little bit earlier about naval presence in the theater. Naval presence is always the most effective and flexible form of presence because you can dial it up and down. And you don't have to worry, again, as I noted earlier, about access, basing, and overflight as you bring those in. So we constantly balance forces in the theater. And I would just close by saying I was the director of the Joint Staff when the NDS was written. I am very much aware of the larger priority we need to place against the China threat, the Russia threat, and other threats. So I know the cost that we ask when we bring forces into the CENTCOM of the war.
Thank you. I appreciate that. In my remaining time, I know I don't have much. I'm wondering if the Secretary could just comment on the diplomatic efforts that are riding alongside our military presence. With respect to Iran specifically,
our major policy continues to be an economic and economic pressure campaign. I don't think many of us see that decreasing anytime soon, and we think that pressure is going to wane over time. Economically, we do think, the Iran economy faces a lot of challenges. They are resilient, but we think that over time, the goal is to bring them back to the negotiating table for a more comprehensive deal.
Thank you. Mr. Bacon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here today. Americans want to see a positive, peaceful outcome in Afghanistan, especially after 18 and a half years of war. We also can't afford to have Afghanistan return to pre-9/11 capability with the Taliban, providing safe haven for Al-Qaeda. I think today we have a minimal presence there at a cost that's much less than what we've had in years past. However, if we withdraw and the Taliban find themselves down and provide safe haven again, I think it'll be a much higher cost later. So those are some of my concerns. So my question to General McKenzie is, what evidence do you have that the Taliban have severed the close ties or alliance with Al-Qaeda?
So we think in terms of two groups that threaten the United States. We're confident that the Taliban's picture on ISIS-K as an example. I can talk a little bit about that. I'm less optimistic about Al-Qaeda. That's something they're going to have to demonstrate. That has not yet been demonstrated. Not the beauty of it, but the fact of it is, if we go forward, we're going to have ample time to see if they actually do that. And that will be before we become irrevocably committed to a force presence that will not allow us to have adequate leverage in Afghanistan. So we don't need to trust them. We don't need to like them. We don't need to believe anything they say. We need to observe what they do, and we have the capability to do that.
That would be the chief concern, is that alliance with Al-Qaeda. Let's say in 2.5 years, the Taliban are largely control Kabul and they're providing safe haven to Al-Qaeda. What's our options at that point? How do we respond? I think the cost would be much higher than what we're putting in now. Just curious for I know it's hypothetical, but just curious for your response. Where do we come in from, and how do we hold them a check?
Sure. So without getting into a hypothetical, I will tell you that we know how we got in 2001. So we have an object lesson of how to enter Afghanistan. It is difficult. It is painful. It's very expensive to do that. But we did it. Having said that, again, I come back to, we talk about this a lot. I think we're going to have a lot of opportunity to see the way this goes forward and the dynamic between the Taliban and the government of Afghanistan. And I'm just not prepared to assume that the Taliban have good intentions, no, but I'm also not prepared to assume that the government of Afghanistan is defenseless and unable to assert themselves and come to a working agreement with the Taliban. We don't know the answer to that question. We're going to have good opportunity to observe and get the answer to this question.
I would say the strength of this is it is delayed. An agreement where we could watch and monitor and turn up the thermostat or lower the thermostat based on Taliban response. So I do appreciate that. Ms. Wolbarger, I want to ask your thoughts on missile defense coordination and integration. As we know, Iran has approximately 1,000 ballistic missiles, and a lot of the countries in the region need to have some capability to respond. How are we doing it, helping them integrate the capabilities instead of every man or woman for himself?
Right. One of our key priorities at the moment is helping Saudi Arabia in particular be more capable of integrated with their own missile defense assets. They do have significant numbers of them. I think the last few decades we've been trying to get them to improve their integration to advance that capability. With respect to integration within the region at large, that I would say is aspirational at best. I mean, you could see these countries eventually improving their defenses by working together, but we have many interagency efforts to try to get our Gulf partners in particular to work more cohesively across numerous lines of effort, and it's a long-term project. I'll just put it that way. But the key, you've heard General McKenzie as well talk about what the military has been able to achieve in advancing particularly Saudi Arabia's capabilities.
When you look at Iranian capabilities, this is probably the primary capability to hold us a threat in our allies.
Sure it is. And I would say Iran actually has about 2,500 to 3,000 missiles.
Thanks for the update.
But the point that Ms. Wolbarger made is integrated air defense, the ability to sit, for example, if I go and look at a console of one of my ballistic missile defense sites in the Middle East, or I go up into another location far west of the theater, we're going to see the whole theater in a common operation. That is strength of the United States approach to war and with our NATO coalition partners. We would like to have that capability replicated in the Gulf. We're working hard to that end. We're doing a small step. It's taken a long time. When I was at J5 at U.S. Central Command in 2011, we said the same thing. So I'm very much aware this is something we have not been very good at. However, the fact that there's a clear, obvious, evident threat tends to focus people. And I think in particular, the human Saudi Arabia is not focused.
I had a question for Gerald Townsend, but I was going to close the comments and run out of time. I just want to commend you for starting Task Force Somalia, especially after the end of the day. I think it's needed. And I think, so I just applaud the effort of your command for doing that. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Lott.
Hi, everyone. Hello. General McKenzie, can you just answer for me, is the U.S. engaged in hostilities against Iran or Iranian forces?
No, we're not.
Do you believe, as CENTCOM commander, that you have authorization for military force against Iran?
No, I do not.
Does the 2001 or 2002 authorization of military force give you authority to get into hostilities with Iran?
With the caveat that you always have the authority to defend yourselves.
Of course, self-defense, but from the authorization.
No, it is not.
According to the IAEA quarterly report that just came out on March 2nd, Iran now has enough enriched uranium to produce a nuclear weapon. They reported 220 pounds of enriched uranium, which is 3 times what they reported in November 2019. Today, in addition to more uranium, we have more spinning centrifuges. The UN has been kicked out of many facilities. In addition, as you noted, Iranian proxies have become more active. We've had, as you say, we crossed a critical threshold with the attacks, the ballistic missile attacks on the El Asad Air Base, which is personally sensitive to me since my son-in-law's unit is on that base. Are we more or less safe as a country from Iran, and are our allies more or less safe than a year ago?
I think I would go from the period of exchange in early January. I think since then we have established a rough deterrence.
Just from a year ago, though. I mean, your best military. I respect your best military advice. In terms of a force protection matter, our allies in the region, ourselves, our partners. When you look at Iran in totality, particularly the nuclear file, which we know is the existential threat, are we more or less safe? Are your forces more or less safe in theater?
So I would say we are more safe in theater now, because last spring there weren't many forces in theater, and the fact that force density was so low was a major part of the Iranian calculus to act out in kinetic spirit. I think that by the posture we have established in the theater, really beginning since May of last year, they are far more constrained than they were a year before then. So yes, I believe we're safe.
From the nuclear threat, are our allies and partners more or less safe from a year ago?
I would defer to Ms. Wilbar on that.
I'll take that. I want to ask a couple of questions on Iraq and Syria. We did lose 2 Marine special operators. My understanding is it took 6 hours to get to these guys. Can you help me understand, since I know many of us are concerned about the golden hour and making sure we get to forces, what happened? Do we have enough on the ground to actually protect the forces we have?
Sure, the terrain was vertical. It was some of the worst terrain in the world. I monitored it hour by hour along the general pathway. There's no way to do it any faster than we did. It's a very tough, difficult, tactical situation. The problems we encountered were not problems of resources. Sometimes you fight in hard ground. Sometimes someone falls a long way and has to be recovered. What you don't want to do is get somebody else killed in that recovery. You put yourself in a situation where you're going to put more lives at risk. I'm completely confident the commanders on the ground did everything they could to get these 2 folks out as quickly as possible.
So should we expect additional, I mean, hopefully not, but killed in action because of the terrain?
Well, so there are different kinds of terrain in Iraq. As you know, this is northeastern Iraq. Terrain is particularly bad up there. That's partially why ISIS is up there. We'll continue to operate there. Anytime something like this happens, we take a look at our tactics, techniques, and procedures to make sure we're going at it the most effective way. But as you know, combat's a clash of human wills, and sometimes the bad guys are going to have a good day.
Can you tell me, there are reports in Syria of drones dropping mortars and grenades on our troops near or around oil fields? Can you help me understand what's happening there, and do we have adequate force protection?
Sure, so we have reports, I don't think as many as in the NPR report, but yes, people work Group 1 UASs, which are the small UASs. They'll try to find a way to carry explosive and fly it over either, not necessarily us alone, but the Russians have had some significant casualties in this regard, as have other nations that are operating there. So yes, it is a problem. We look at it very hard. It's one of my highest priorities.
Who's operating those drones?
So I think probably in this case, ISIS but we're still working that. But if I had to judge today, I would say it's possibly ISIS, but probably not a state entity operating drones.
Okay, I yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Gallagher. Just a quick follow-up. Do we know, are those commercial off-the-shelf DJI drones that they weaponize?
That would be my guess. They're, as you know, they're universally available.
And another follow-up to Ms. Lochner's questions. So I think we're getting ready later this week to vote on SJ Res 68, which directs the president to terminate the use of armed forces for hostilities against Iran. Well, you've just said we are not engaged in hostilities against Iran. So one could say this legislation is unnecessary, but in your professional military judgment, what do you assess would be the impact of this legislation, particularly when it comes to our deterrent posture with respect to Iran?
So I have to confess, I'm not familiar with it. I know the legislation exists. I've not done a detailed study of it. I know that our ability to secure land effectively comes from two things: our capability and our will. And so the ability to demonstrate those two things are what provides a cognitive effect in the mind of the person you want to deter, that no, you don't actually want to do something now.
Well, that's the same question to Ms. Woodbury.
I think I'd follow up similarly that a signal to any potential adversaries that we don't have support of Congress to defend ourselves if necessary would send a signal that would not be helpful to deterrence.
And just to reiterate, we are not engaged in hostilities with Iran, though we retain, as always, inherently, under Article 2, the right to defend ourselves if attacked.
Yes.
Similarly, are you aware of anything you're doing today exclusively because of the 2002 AU event? Not the 2001, the 2002 AU event. Are you aware of anything you're doing that relies on the 2002 AU event?
As you know, that 2002 AMS provided budgeting authority for what we're doing in Syria, because the threat of ISIS emanating from Syria has been a supplemental justification for our military activity there. Our coalition forces, for example, rely on the defense of Iraq for their justification, so it's a mutual sign that we see that the threat from ISIS from Iraq. I will say that I think that the notification you all received on the Tuesday morning site did include an additional 2002 AMF justification for domestic legal basis.
At the time, we got vague assessments about perhaps some detentions we have relying on 2002 AMF. For the record, I disagree with that. I'm with you on opposing an attempt to undermine our deterrent posture with Iran, and I think that legislation is unnecessary. I think it's far past time for us to repeal the 2002 AMF. I think it's doing no work at all, and it'd be a good matter of congressional hygiene when it comes to war powers. But that's a debate for another day. Quickly, I know we've had a lot of discussion about Afghanistan. General McKenzie, in the PD-21 budget request, it looks like the request for Operation Freedom Sentinel is $14 billion, while the request for enduring OCO requirements is $28 billion. So to clarify, if all U.S. service members left Afghanistan, would that $14 billion go down to zero, while that $28 billion would stay roughly the same as other forces stationed within the CENTCOM AOR would continue to conduct CT operations?
I'll have to come back to you on the details of that. I can tell you, it's my understanding that that budget does affect the proposed force level of 8.6 thousand in OFS going forward from like July of this next year. But I will have to take that into the record and come back with you with the detailed questions that you just asked.
And then for those who are concerned about the rapidity of our withdrawal from Afghanistan, what what vital stake, if any, in Afghanistan, and what is the geopolitical importance of that?
So the vital national interest that threatens us from Afghanistan is the ability of Al-Qaeda and ISIS-K to generate attacks against the homeland of the United States and against the homelands of our allies and partners. So we've seen that happen. We know that's not something that we're talking about as a conditional future possibility. We know that it's happened in the past. The best intelligence estimates tell us that if we do not maintain pressure on those two entities, that in a period of time, and you can say a year, you can say 2 years, you can say somewhere in between, they're going to generate the ability to do external attacks again. And that will manifest itself here in the United States. That is vital national interest.
And then finally, and most broadly, in only 25 seconds, I know no theater commander is ever going to argue for less attention and resources, but do you understand the basic premise of the NGS, which is that because China is facing threat, Indo-PACOM is the priority theater, not CENTCOM?
I was the Joint Staff J5, Director of Strategic Plans and Policy, and the Director of the Joint Staff during the creation of that document. I was present at the creation. I'm intimately familiar with it.
A great title for a memoir.
It is.
Thank you, Ms. Torres-Small.
Thank you, Ms. Chair, thank you, Ranking Member, and thank you all so much for your service. General McKenzie, I really appreciated your comments during your opening statement about how important it is that we be adaptable to future Iranian threats. And DoD has spent billions of dollars on kinetic and non-kinetic counter-drone systems to that effect. These systems are often tested at White Sands Missile Range, which is in the district that I represent. However, they have yet to be fielded widely, and I remain concerned that our operators are under significant threat from especially small drones and enemy drone swarms, especially from Iran and its allies and proxies. Is it accurate that your command is experimenting with new and more effective counter-drone capabilities that utilize artificial intelligence and autonomous systems?
We aggressively pursue anything that will improve capabilities, particularly against those Group 1 and 2 UASs, as you mentioned. That is one of the things that worries me the most in the theater every day, is the vulnerability of our forces to those small UASs.
And specifically to the question about AI and autonomous
So
systems?
I am aware of some experimentation. I'll have to come back to you on more details on that.
Okay,
I would tell you that we have a very broad set of joint requirements to drive that, so it's possible there's something there.
We'll take that for the record. It's
Sure.
my understanding there's been specific testing at Lutzmer, so I'd love to look into that further. And I'll submit this question to the record as well. But can you please provide us a plan for FY21 that would enable us to accelerate the efforts that you are taking?
Absolutely. I'll be delighted to do that.
Fantastic. And are your command's needs for effective counter-drone systems being met currently?
I'm convinced the system is generating as much as it can. The Secretary and I have talked about this. I own a lot of the systems that are available across the entire United States inventory. I am not satisfied with where we are, and I believe we are at great risk because of this.
And so you're also exploring options that we do not currently own.
That is correct. We're open to anything, and a lot of smart people are looking at this. We're not there yet, but I think the Army and the executive agency for this will actually help in a lot of ways to provide a focus to these efforts. So this is a significant threat.
Thank you so much. Switching over to Africa briefly, it is estimated that over the next decade, 7 out of the 10 of the world's fastest growing economies will be in Africa. Against the backdrop of tremendous opportunity on the continent, China has ramped up its engagement, and this was distributed to all of us. I think it's a pretty clear example of China's ramped up engagement. Not only surpassing the United States as Africa's largest trading partner, but also expanding its military presence through an overseas base in Djibouti and increased arms sales. And what's interesting is this also shows that Djibouti has one of the largest debts to China on the continent. So General Townsend, is it accurate that strategic investments in development and diplomacy support defense to demonstrate that the United States is a better partner for developing countries than China?
Absolutely they do. We work at AFRICOM, we work every day hand in hand with our diplomatic partners and our development partners.
Thank you so much. And likewise, what are the national security costs of ceding ground to our competitors like China, especially in continents like Africa?
Well, as you can see from the diagrams, Russia and China are competing really hard on the African continent. I don't believe that we have to outcompete them in all 53 countries of the AFCOM AOR, 54 including Egypt on the continent. You don't have to outcompete them everywhere, but we have to pick and choose where the U.S. access and influence in the future. And there's probably some places where maybe if they have the edge over us, it's okay. It's not critical for our national security. So So I think that it's very important that we look at the continent and decide where we want to prioritize our efforts.
Where do you think we're not investing now that we really should be?
I think global or great power competition.
Within Africa?
Yeah. I think we're appropriately focused right now, and the whole point of this blank slate or COCOM review that the Secretary is running the entire department is to focus all of our efforts more at global power competition than we have been in the past. So I think we've got the right focus.
And I can take that for the record if you want to supplement any specific location.
Sure.
Thank you. I yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Byrne?
You said we need to prioritize. What would you say are?
Well, the Secretary of Defense has given me clear guidance. First is to maintain our U.S. ability to implement our war plans in the world. And second is to compete with China and Russia. Third is to focus on the counter-violent extremists, the violent extremist groups that threaten U.S. interests in the U.S. homeland. And fourth is to be prepared to respond to crises on the African continent. So those are my priorities from the Secretary of Defense. They're clear, and we're working through how we actually ensure those are actually resources.
Trying to make up a competition with Western China. Are there targets you have within that?
There are, and they basically revolve around ensuring we have access and influence in selected parts of the continent, and I'd prefer to take the rest of that and classify it.
Fair enough. One more thing, you say this classified do you feel like that you have the resources that you need to meet those targets?
Today, I think AFRICOM is adequately resourced to do what we've been told to do.
Let me ask you about, maybe you're not quite person to ask you to ask anyway. Where are we on radio plans?
I'll defer to my colleague from the Department of Defense.
Yes, if I could just respond to a few different questions just quickly. I just want to highlight that our overall competition with Russia and China on the continent is a whole government effort, more than just the military tool. We have Prosper Africa, which is a White House-driven effort to increase economic activity from our private sector in Africa, find ways for the African economies to adjust better to private sector entities and from the Western model, and less just the sort of predatory funding that the Chinese provide, as well as supplemented by diplomacy and development aid. So we do have a very strong whole government effort that prioritizes more than just the military component. I lost your second question. Sorry. Libya, yes. We are very concerned with events in Libya. Obviously, it's a location of numerous other powers competing with each other. You see Russia, you see Egypt, you see Turkey. Our overarching strategy is to continue to be able to address the terrorism threat that we see there, and I think we can effectively address that while bringing diplomacy to bear to bring both sides of basically the civil war together. Recognizing that the military tool in Libya needs to be part of a functional government and not actually running that government. So we continue to work with the sort of both competing factions and also try to call on other powers to not continue to destabilize and ignore arms embargoes that are in place.
Things gotten worse or better?
I would say they've gotten worse.
What are we doing about that?
Well, we are, again, our number one priority for us is the counterterrorism effort. Number two, with respect to the ongoing strikes, it's a diplomatic-led effort from our State Department colleagues, trying to work with our European partners as well to bring the conflict to an end, given as General Counsel said earlier, the threat emanating from Northern Africa is acutely a European challenge. But we are very cognizant, especially from the Department of Defense's perspective of what we see as the Russian and something that, and it's something that is complicating and a challenge. Yemen, yes. Once again, the U.S. is trying to support our diplomatic colleagues at the State Department and the UN, led by Martin Griffith, in his efforts to bring those competing forces together. We have seen some success in the keeping agreement between the two sides, and some effort to have, I would call it ceasefire, but minimize hate violence. The Houthis, like the Taliban, are not easily trusted, but we believe that there's renewed interest, I think, from the Saudi-led coalition to find an end to the conflict, but we continue to believe there is no military solution to it. It has to be a diplomatic, political solution, and also as we continue to support our Saudi and UAE partners and how they need to defend themselves against the UAE and both of these challenges coming out of Yemen.
And based on that assessment, he came up with an 8,600 number. Is that correct? I'm sorry, I can't.
That's correct. That is correct.
Okay. General Miller told a group of us when we were in Afghanistan in October, and then again during testimony in December, that that 8,600 drawdown was going to occur regardless of whether or not there was an agreement with the Taliban. Is that your understanding as well?
No, that is not my understanding. Our understanding is this was driven, that this was a plan that we held. We could adopt it if directed to do so, but we didn't have clear guidance to do it until recently. So we were not planning to do this until we received presidential direction. It may seem like a very fine point, but it's actually a big deal. We have plans for a lot of things. We had a plan to go to 8,600.
No, it is a big deal, but so you're saying that the 8,600 drawdown was only going to occur if there was a peace agreement with the Taliban. Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying from the military side, we were going to go to 8,600 when directed to do so by national leadership in the United States. I defer the rest of that actually to Ms. Wilbarger.
I'll just add, I do think based on General Miller's advice, we were prepared and planned to go 8,600, and the Secretary was prepared to adjust the force posture in the absence of an agreement if that was in our national security interest, and the decision had been made to do so.
Okay, independent of an agreement with the Taliban.
He was prepared to do that if it looked like it was necessary or appropriate for us, given our desire to instill readiness in force and being able to achieve the mission.
Well, as of October of 2019, was it your understanding that drawdown was to occur?
No.
Okay, how about December of 2019?
It was a contingency, but it was we didn't have a date to start it, and no intent to execute it until directed. We had no direction to do so.
Well, then the folks in this committee are getting contradictory information, and I would recommend that you clear it up within the Department of Defense. Secondly, I had the opportunity to review the entire agreement, including the annexes. 2,400 Americans have given their lives in Afghanistan. Over 20,000 have been wounded. This is America's war, not any one administration's war. Are there plans for within the administration to release the entire agreement so the American public can see under what terms we are going to be withdrawing from Afghanistan?
My understanding is that the two side agreements or annexes are not public for operational requirements. I don't know my colleagues on why that is the case, and that they're monitored to be secret from the cities, but continue to be not public to the public.
I would echo that.
Okay, well, I've read the entire agreement, and I see no reason why they could not be released, and I just want to be very clear that I believe, as do many people on this committee, that the American public deserve to know under what terms we are withdrawing from Afghanistan. Lastly, in October, when a group of us was in Afghanistan, it was very clear to us by everybody that we talked to that the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces was incapable of standing up on its own anytime in the next couple of years. Yet under the plan, we will completely withdraw, including support services and contractors, within 14 months. If that occurs, will the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces be capable of standing up on its own?
That's going to be another discovery-based process as we go forward. So we're going to go to 8,600 by the summer. Conditions on the ground will dictate if we go below that. If conditions on the ground are not permissive, my advice would not be to continue that reduction. That would not be my decision. That would be my advice. So that would be based on performance of the Afghan military, their ability to incorporate the Taliban, if the Taliban is going to be incorporated at all. I will have an opportunity to give advice on this. I had an opportunity to give advice on the decisions that have just been made. So these are not things that will happen in and of themselves.
So 14 months from now, the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces are not capable of standing up on their own and defending Afghanistan and the government. It will be your advice not to withdraw those support services.
Absolutely, that would be my advice. But that's a future contingency, and there are a lot of, it's going to be far more complex than just that. But yes, I will have an opportunity to give that advice.
Okay. And what are we doing, pivoting to Iraq very briefly, what are we doing now to protect the Syrian Kurds, stateless persons, and Syrian nationals who fought with us, to make sure that them and their families are secure against attacks in the region?
So as you know, the area that we control in Syria with our Kurdish partners is generally what we call the Eastern Syria Security Area. We have trained and continue to train significant internal security forces to maintain local security. We can be answerable for that to our SDF partners and to our other partners there. I'm confident that we have measures in place to protect them now. I'm obviously less confident in going to Western Syria because we don't have the ability to reach out there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brooks.
Thank you. I've got 4 quick points before I get to my questions. Point number 1, General McKenzie, in your written testimony, you state that, quote, all wars have a political end, end quote. I think that's very insightful. Number 2, the United States has been in Afghanistan the time equivalent of a little bit more than 5 World War IIs. 5 World War IIs. That's a remarkable statistic. Number 3, in my judgment, our military has performed superbly and we've won in Afghanistan. We effectively destroyed Al-Qaeda's operational capability in the early years of the war. We toppled the Taliban government and we killed Osama bin Laden. Number 4, I am skeptical that the Afghan people adequately appreciate America's sacrifice of American lives and treasury on their behalf. Perhaps you have a different view on that. That's my view. I don't think we're properly appreciating the sacrifices that we've engaged in Afghanistan. With that kind of as a backdrop, the question. The text of the Afghan peace agreement appears to commit the United States to withdrawing its forces within 14 months subject to conditions on the ground. General McKenzie, why was 14 months chosen?
I would defer to the negotiator to arrive at that point. I cannot answer the question why 14 versus 13 versus 22 months. I do not know the answer to that question, sir.
Does 14 months allow America to withdraw its forces and equipment from Afghanistan safely?
It does if conditions are applied to that withdrawal, and we hold to the conditions.
What is the least amount of time needed to safely withdraw American forces and equipment from Afghanistan?
I prefer to talk about that in closed session, and I'd be happy to do that.
Ms. Wheelberger, same 3 questions. First, why was 14 months chosen?
Unfortunately, I do have to defer to the State Department negotiators as well. I don't have insight.
Do you have a judgment as to whether that 14 months allows America adequate time to safely withdraw our forces and equipment?
I trust my military colleagues to do all they can to ensure any removal or retrograde of our troops is done as with force protection being their #1 priority.
And do you also have no opinion that you're willing to express in this setting about the minimum amount of time required for us to safely withdraw our troops and our equipment, salvageable equipment, from Afghanistan?
I would assess that 14 months is probably enough time to withdraw, but safely, I just want to second what we said before, which is 14 months is aspirational, trying to set sort of a timeline suggestion that both sides can see their objectives potentially being fulfilled, and therefore giving us the conditions that we feel within our national security interest to actually withdraw. Again, all of this is going to be based on whether the commitments are made and the security situation is such that we can continue to defend our own interests.
General Townsend, moving to Africa, what in your judgment are the most important flashpoints or critical areas in Africa at this time that we should focus our primary efforts on?
First, I'd say Somalia, and specifically southern Somalia, from Kenya, border southern part of Somalia. Secondly, I would say in West Africa, in the Sahel region, in the tri-border region that's formed by Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, and where that descends down to the littoral states.
Back to General McKenzie. If the Afghan assault did not begin as scheduled, would the United States delay its troop withdrawal, and if so, for how long? And perhaps Ms. Wheelberger would be better to answer that, but I'll defer to each of you.
So I would defer to her, but I would also point out to you that withdrawal has begun.
About 3,000 troops, more or less?
It's a small number. It's not linear. It'll go, you won't be a certain number every week as units come and go, but it has begun.
And second, in my conversations with the secretary, his comfort level with that withdrawal decision was not just based on the agreement, but based on the assessment that we can continue to achieve our missions with that force posture. If something on the ground changes in light of the Taliban not keeping its commitments, not just on the inter-Afghan agreement, but on their use of violence, it's a decision he's willing to readdress.
Well, I pray that we will not be there indefinitely. Thank you for your service.
Thank you. Ms. Houlihan.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here today. My question has to do with women and girls. The beginning parts of my question. The Women, Peace, and Security Act reflects the growing body of evidence confirming that the inclusion of women in peace and the peace process helps to reduce conflict and to advance stability. Research shows that higher levels of gender equality are associated with lower propensity for conflict. Data from countries around the world demonstrate that women's inclusion in peacekeeping units, police forces, and in the security sector improves accountability and decreases abuse against civilians. So one of my first questions, and this goes along with Mr. Crow's question, is can you first comment on whether or not there was any aspect of the agreement with the Taliban that related to women and to girls?
Based on my conversations with my State Department colleagues, the focus on just being an inclusive inter-Afghan agreement would include the necessity that women in particular are part of the peace negotiations, inter-Afghan peace negotiations.
Gentlemen?
I would associate my remarks with that. The only other point I would say is I particularly agree with you that the inclusion of women in policing activities and low-level tactical activities is extremely helpful. It is difficult to achieve in Afghanistan, as you are aware, but our inability to do better than we are having the results we're getting is not from a lack of trying. We're trying very hard on that.
Sure.
I can't speak to the Taliban.
So my understanding is that there is no inclusion of women and girls in the agreement, in any of the aspects of the agreement. And so I find that really disappointing, and I don't know who to aim my ire at. And so I just would like to understand that better, and maybe offline, if we have the opportunity to talk about that, I would appreciate it, because it certainly seems that everybody, and I was on the trip with Mr. Crow, everyone who we were with assured us that that was important. And we had opportunities to meet with a lot of folks about that particular issue, and it would be really disappointing if that was the case. Can you comment now on how AFRICOM and CENTCOM have engaged within counterterrorism efforts in your regions? How are you working to make sure that we do continue to include this important part of our population?
Sure. So women's in peace and security is sort of part of our DNA at AFRICOM. I actually have a full-time gender advisor on our staff there. This is an issue that is embedded in every training that we do on the continent, or in Europe, for example. And so just three quick examples. We had a recent communications symposium, which I spoke at, where we brought women, armed forces from African nations to Germany for the symposium. We conducted a female intel officer course on the continent, and we just had a fairly large-scale exercise called Flintlock, which was a Special Operations Forces exercise. We had a women peace and security component to it. So we worked this hard to impress upon our African partners the importance of it.
So I would echo what General Townsend said. You know, we have two tactical areas of operation where the ability of women to interact at the tactical level is critical to obtain cultural entry into locations. So on the U.S. and on the coalition side, fully embedded, it's a critical capability. We simply cannot do without. I'm referring specifically to Afghanistan, Iraq, and parts of Syria as well. Outreach to our partners is better in some areas than others. Afghanistan, there are profound cultural barriers to doing it. We work it across the entire theater. It is integral to all our training activities, and so I'm very big supporter of it.
Sure, I'll just add, I myself have visited the female commandos that work with Sergeant Miller, and they're impressive and important. I'll also add, from my perspective, from my position, one of the things I try to put a lot of energy to is meeting with parliamentarians, female parliamentarians around the world, because including female voices, not in security sections, but actually in representation of democracy, is part of what we push forward. So that's a key point that I strive to do.
And I couldn't obviously agree with you more, and I did have the opportunity when I was over with the Crodel is what we called it, to have the opportunity to meet with our side, who is leading the charge on women and girls issues. I only have 30 seconds.
seconds left, so I'll just ask this question for the record. General Votel, your predecessor, General McKenzie, stated that cyber will be integrated through all operations. However, CENTCOM continues to be challenged by constrained resources, including trained cybersecurity personnel. I was wondering if you could comment on whether or not you continue to feel the effects of constrained cyber resources and trained personnel, and how you would propose to solve that issue. And the same for both theaters. And I only have 4 seconds, so if it's okay, I'll just take that for the record.
We'll come back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Skundelback.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chairman, thank you for being here. One thing I do want to mention, I'm a little taken back that we had left Sudan on the state sponsor of terrorism list, along with countries like Iran. That country's come a long way since the incident of her, and disappointed that the State Department put additional conditions on them coming off that list as we look to work by with and through countries in that region. If we leave them on the state sponsor of terrorism, they're left with no choice but to move towards China and Russia. So I hope that any assistance you can give us with helping resolve that, you will do. As we talk about China, I'm extremely concerned, especially about the natural resource extraction. And as we met with you in Peacekeeping Mission in Mali, they expressed concerns that effectively the theft of the natural resources in many of the countries would immediately lead to civil war in many of those countries, and I hope that we are attempting to make sure that people of those countries get a square deal as much as possible. General Townsend, thank you for your hospitality as some colleagues of mine visited AFRICOM. I've been in that area a couple of times. One, I was with General Fernandez at Ready for approximately a week, went to Mandalay, spent some time in Somalia, Mogadishu. I'm a little taken back at the lack of assets at that base, for it to be under the command of somebody, I believe it was a two-star at the time, and just very, very few assets in Djibouti. And I'm concerned about the lack of assets available to our teams in the region. General Townsend, you were very kind in providing resources to my colleagues and I to travel to see a couple of your ODA teams in Africa. We saw one ODA operating with the 127 ECHO program, one team operating without. Could you speak to the members of the committee about the differences in the teams that operate with the 127 ECHO program and those that operate without it?
Sure. Congressman, first, you asked about, let me kind of double back to something you said a moment ago about, we hope that we're helping these countries get a square deal with the Chinese. The Department of State has an initiative where they review contracts with these countries. It's a free service. Bring your contracts in. We'll read the Chinese version, we'll read the version in your language, and we'll tell you where the traps are and if there's differences in the version. I think this has gone a long way to help some of the countries on the continent avoid these debt trap problems. To your question about resources in Africa, I've served around the globe a lot of time in CENTCOM. In AFRICOM, our troops and our efforts there are the most thinly resourced that any I have ever encountered or had to contend with. That said, we're not in the lead in any place on the African continent. We support our international partners, African partners, European partners, etc., AMISOM, UN, AU partners. So I think if our troops are frustrated, could they do more if they had more? Absolutely they could, but it's not their place to do more. It's their place to support our partners. That's our role. And sometimes that's a little hard to get our more junior leaders to understand, because they know what they can do, especially veterans of other theaters know what they can do if they had more resources. So we are constrained, but I think it's by deliberate choice. Your specific question about 127 ECHO and, for example, a 333 resource force are significant. The 127 Echo essentially has full resourcing because it's a force that is operating with U.S. Oversight and control, and the 333 program is a partner force. They're just different sections authorized by Congress as to what we can provide those forces.
General, I'm very short on time. I again want to thank you, but I do want to mention this, and this is not a military mission. It would be more of a State Department mission. But we're bringing men in, predominantly men in that area, and we are training them in military tactics, and they have effectively a third-grade education level. And we have them 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. I do think that it would be worthwhile for the United States with other governments through some type of an aid program, provide educational resources for those men while they're there on those bases. Otherwise, we're training somebody and then releasing them without an education.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just preface by stating the obvious. Africa is a large continent, 3.5 times the size of the United States, 54 nations, very diverse in its challenges and opportunities. So as I ask my questions, I don't want anyone to think that I'm confused that it's, one nation and homogenous or monolithic. General Townsend, I think you're right, that our soldiers may not be, they said, I'm quoting you, not their place to do more. But I will say that after meeting with you in Stuttgart, with Representative Scott, when we went to Africa, USAID said they could do more if there were more of you. The State Department mission said that they could do more if there were more of you. So there's a lot more that could be happening in Africa in terms of development and diplomacy with a larger military presence. Let me ask you this question. And I really appreciate this placement that you provided a classified version when we were in Stuttgart. It's scary to look at the trend line of China's presence, both the infrastructure, the business investments, the arms sales. African nations don't want to be caught in the middle between the United States and China or Russia. But my question is, what will the DoD, AFRICOM, do to assure and ultimately deliver on the desire to be the preferred partner for African nations? And while you're answering that, maybe you can once again just define great power competition with China in Africa.
Thanks. So first part of your question about great power, global power competition, I like to refer to it. Really, it's all about gaining and maintaining influence. That's what that competition is all about. So in some future rainy day, we have the access and the influence that we need. So we're in a struggle with China and Russia to gain and maintain that influence. What they want from us, so we can't compete with China. We're not going to build stadiums and railroads and ports and palaces, which are all things China builds on the continent. But what they do want from us, they want help building their capacity of their security forces, and they want our help with the counterterrorism problem that they have. So even though some people may not necessarily agree with us, I believe in Africa, building partner capacity and the counterterrorism efforts or the counter-VDO efforts are a way we do global great power competition in Africa. Because that's what our partners are hungry for. They come to us because of our capacity to do that. They come to us because of our skill. And they come to us because of how we treat them and our values.
Let me interject another question. Can you briefly describe how you're going to deploy the first Security Force Assistant Brigade that you now have in your AOR?
Sure. So I can cover this in more detail in the classified section, but we have them. They're already. Some of them are already on the contract. They've been leaning forward since about October, and they do very quickly once we got approval. We're going to deploy them in some countries with persistent presence. In some of our highest priority countries, we'll have persistent presence for those partners, and in other countries, we'll have a sort of an episodic or a scheduled presence. So in some places, they'll take up, elevate our game because they can guys that train at a higher level than some of our soft forces that are actually training, at units of action at the small unit level.
Let me see if I can get this one in. I know it's an austere environment, and I was there in August. I mean, it takes weeks to get major end items in place. I mean, if not months, it takes weeks to get repair parts to the ODA teams. Now that you're bringing in the SFAB, I mean, what infrastructure needs? What are the unmet infrastructure needs, logistical support needs on the continent?
I don't think that the SFAB has any additional requirements that other elements of DoD have on the ground. Theirs are basically the same. We'll make sure they have the right support, the right security, wherever we send them in Africa, they'll be properly supported. I think they're going to probably, if any of them are veterans of Afghanistan or Iraq, they're going to be shocked when they first arrive by the level of resourcing I referred to earlier, how thinly resourced Africa is. It's going to be very austere, very expeditionary for some
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I just want to emphasize the point that General Townsend and Mr. Brown elicited is, what's the value add that we have to build relationships in Africa? China's throwing all kinds of money around, but it really is. During my trip in Tunisia, actually, this is a huge point. I mean, they want us and need us as the most reliable partner on security. That is something that Russia and China really can't offer. They don't have the sustainable equipment, they don't have the training. It's a skill set that we bring that helps us build that relationship. Obviously, there are other things that we do, diplomacy, USAID, and all that. But that security relationship is a way to build partnerships in Africa without question.
First, let me thank all of you for your service to our country and making yourself available today. General Kinsey, in your unfunded priorities list, you address the need for mobile drones and surveillance to increase your ISR capability for base resilience and defense. Is that something, are you trying to fill a gap, or is it have enough ISR capability for that?
Every command commander wants more ISR capability. Your current plans to reduce the number, particularly of MQ-9 drones that are available, we would like to see if there's a way that we can keep raising the fleet to continue to use them. I recognize that there's a pressing requirement for those drones worldwide, and there are other places that they can be used. Nonetheless, we believe we have a genuine requirement for them, both in the VEO fight as well as positioned against Iran. Even though the MQ-9 is a vulnerable platform against some Iranian capabilities. Nonetheless, particularly in places like the Strait of Hormuz and other areas, it gives us visibility and intelligence-gathering capabilities that we might not otherwise have.
Was this a request that you put in your base request list and was pushed to a youth list, or was it initially put in the youth list?
That's right. I'll have to come back to you on the details of that. I believe that we're responding to a desire, a very reasonable and understandable about desire by the Air Force to invest in some really distant systems in their request, so we were reacting to that. I will have to come back to you with a detailed answer to that as well.
Great, and I very much appreciate your Birmingham, Alabama accent. I'm glad you haven't lost it in all your years of service in that world. So I picked up on it real quick. General Townsend, your recent completion of the exercise Flintlock exercise 2020 with your African partners. Tell me about what, if anything, that did to increase your capability to combat violent extremists in the region.
Thanks, Congressman. I'd like to also join General McKenzie in his comments about the ISR. We're in the same boat as CENTCOM. So we understand that those resources could be used elsewhere in the world. We also know that the Air Force would like to transition to higher-end, more capable platforms, and they're going to have to invest some of the lower-end stuff. But the lower-end stuff works really well for us in AFRICOM and CENTCOM. On your question about Flintlock. So Flintlock is an exercise for Special Operations Forces, and it's very much directly focused on counterterrorism. It's about improving and building partner capacity. So these countries come together, and we operated this year in Mauritania and in Senegal, were the two main areas of focus. And I think that you could just read from some of the quotes from some of the press reports of the participants and how much they got out of Flintlock. I thought Flintlock is one of our more successful exercises. I think it helps build capacity for counterterrorism operations in Africa writ large.
And it's an annual exercise.
It is.
How many years has it been taking place?
I'm sorry.
How many years has it been taking place?
No, I don't know. I'll have to take that and get back to that.
Mr. Barton, tell me about the department's objectives in Syria and how they comply with the overarching objectives of the CENTCOM.
The military's objectives, the department's objectives in Syria remains the ISIS, enduring defeat of ISIS. The U.S. government has broader objectives in Syria, which includes also political settlement along the lines of 2254, the UN process, as well as having fewer Iranian forces in Syria. But the military component is the de-ISIS campaign, and we have continued that fight continuously, even while we repositioned our forces based on presidential guidance over the years.
Thank you.
Can we do Charles Hall and Mr. Gallego, and then we do classified. So, Charles Hall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome to all the witnesses. China has steadily increased its influence in Africa through its Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, showing the effectiveness of soft power. China has pledged $60 billion in new financing for African countries and is now the continent's biggest trading partner, with Sino-African trade topping $200 billion per year. While there is bipartisan criticism for BRI, the U.S. must be able to offer an alternative narrative. Secretary Will Barker, what actions is DoD taking in conjunction with other federal agencies to offer an alternative to BRI in Africa? I know this was raised earlier, but I'm not sure the answers were as substantive as they can be.
Of course, so the administration does have a policy to increase trade and development on the continent. It's called Prosper Africa. I think the efforts are primarily focused again on other agencies, but the idea is how can we make the economic models within Africa and comport more with our industry standards or our economic way of doing business, rather than just sort of the Chinese way of just sort of flowing in money. We do, of course, recognize that a lot of this has to do with how we speak to our partners and how we can highlight their short-term economic gains in the near term might result in long-term loss of sovereignty. And we've seen this in other countries. And I think many of our African partners are actually starting to see that that's affecting them, that the economic benefits that they think they're going to get rapidly aren't necessarily accruing to them specifically. Many Chinese companies that are there, they don't hire local workforce. They're really just extracting the resources and not providing a lot of benefit to the countries themselves. So it's not just what we can do in addition to bringing economic might in, but also highlighting that they're actually setting themselves up for a long-term challenging relationship if they're going to rely on Chinese monetary investment.
Thank you, General Townsend. Has BRI undermined or threatened partnerships or security cooperation on the continent?
I think the short answer is yes. I think that the BRI is just part of a larger strategic approach that China has, not only to Africa but the world, but in Africa it's playing out. Their approach is Belt and Road Initiative, bilateral engagement, multilateral engagement. It's very much a whole of government approach. It's easier for them to orchestrate their whole of government maybe than it is for us to do so. And they're putting a lot of money in. So it's without question they are able to buy influence in Africa, not only from partners maybe who are willing to take bribes, but they're willing to buy. They can buy influence from even pretty strong partners because they're partners in need.
Thank you. I want to turn to climate change and its nexus with our national security. 9 of 10 most climate change vulnerable states are in sub-Saharan Africa, and in a region whose total population is expected to double between now and 2050. General Townsend, I'm sure you have considered how the changing climate will impact security needs and operations. How are you managing the risk of regional instability due to the impacts of climate change, such as increasingly dangerous natural disasters and food and water insecurity?
Well, Congressman, as you said, we see the effects of climate change all over Africa today. desertification, the creeping southward of the Sahara Desert is just one of those. Competition for water, which has the potential to erupt into state-on-state conflict in a couple of places. And we're dealing with locust swarms. Not only do we have coronavirus, we have locust swarms on the African continent, in East Africa right now. So these are all problems that we have to deal with. They don't really have military solutions. This is where we have to work with our partners, not only our own State Department and our own USAID, but also NGOs and international partners as well.
Do you feel we're being effective, taking a whole government approach with all these different agencies addressing this issue?
Well, I think some of these challenges defy solutions by any one nation. Desertification and the water competition, for example. With the smaller scale problem of Ebola and locust swarms, I think we are. There's an international effort to help, and I know the United States is contributing to both of those. And in fact, in the case of Ebola, the countries that are dealing with that have developed a self-capacity to handle that problem without a lot of outside assistance. That's an example of where we have that.
Thank you, General. Mr. Jerry, okay.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you. Ms. Wilbarger, we've heard a number of data points of our African partner, AFRICOM itself, getting less attention and funding. What is the risk that we're accepting in doing so?
We'll take this opportunity to highlight that the Secretary has not made any decisions other than moving his FAB into the continent. He is continuing to review all options, weighing that against the risk. And I think from my perspective, one of the primary ones is the long-term risk of the evolution and the participation of terrorist organizations. They are one way today, but if you don't maintain the pressure where they exist, they will always be people that have both the capability and the will to attack us in the homeland. So our ability to maintain focus across the continent is really necessary in this risk calculation.
General Thompson, what is your opinion on this increased risk that she identified?
I think I agree with her assessment of the risk, and I also agree with her characterization that so far no decisions have been made other than I have gained an SDAB for AFRICOM.
Follow up, Judge Hudson, I noticed on the front page of your testimony you have a statement that says, secure and stable Africa is an enduring American interest. So would you agree that scaling back our already modest Africa presence will mean that your command will be less resources to fight for the national interests, our national interests on the African continent?
Congressman, I agree that if we have less resources, we'll be able to do less.
Great. So then just a follow-up, and this could be to anyone at the table here. If AFRICOM is realigned to deal with the great power competition, why is the security cooperation budget for the continent planning for a $72 million cut? Where will these programs be cut? What parts of the continent will this be cut? Who will this come from? Because it seems it's contradicting everything that we're hearing. If we're going to realign to focus on great power competition, then we should show that in the budget also. Ms. Wilbarger, you want to start?
I'll start by just highlighting again the zero-based review the Secretary is doing, looking at resources in Africa. His intent is to see if there are missions that we recognize are critical and need to achieve can be done in more efficient or effective ways. It doesn't necessarily mean absorbing more risk. It could mean just, is there a better way to do the mission that we're already doing? With respect to security cooperation at large, I mean, we have a lot of global requirements on security cooperation. My perspective is, particularly the theaters that have low posture, you need to look at other tools that you have at your disposal, and then work with security cooperation assistance, 333 programs, for example, are invaluable to maintaining the security partnerships we have. With respect to the specific programmatic numbers that you brought up, unless you don't count the specifics, I think we're probably going to have to take the specifics for the record.
I would just add, I think that some of the most important programs that we have are programs like FMF, IMET, FMS, 333 programs, state partnership programs. A lot of those programs I'm advocating for are not even Department of Defense programs, but those are tremendously valuable for us, especially in global power competition.
it just seems like $75 million compared to how big our budget is. Seems like it'd be, it would be very naive for us to just cut that funding. So you do good work. And then just last question, because they are probably our closest allies on the continent and have the most experience. Have you had discussions with our French allies about their posture to make decisions about our posture in Africa this year?
Yes, the Secretary has several meetings with his counterpart, Mr. Farley. She understands the Secretary's need to restore readiness to the force and to review all missions and all support for partners. The French do highlight, of course, the importance of U.S. enabling support to their operations. They just keep some capabilities they simply do not have, and what we have been doing is trying to encourage them to speed up their decision making on having those capabilities for themselves, so they no longer are relying on the United States support.
Feel that. Thank you. That will conclude, excuse me, this portion of the hearing. We'll give you like a 10-minute break, and we'll reconvene at 12:10, 22:12. Thank you. We are adjourned.
dude. Oh, just trying to fucking. Fucking barely missing some shit. Get out of here, dude.